I thought I would begin by talking very briefly about the document whose discovery gave rise to the research, and then about two of the major interpretive questions whose exploration we hope would be made possible by following this trail. And then I'll close with maybe a brief word about using a family itinerary to examine certain dimensions of the age of emancipation. So the project began really with pieces of paper that looked to be out of place. The boxes in the Cuban National Archive that hold the incoming correspondence directed to General Máximo Gómez, who was one of the leaders of the Cuban War of Independence. In 1899, he was probably the most famous man in Havana. And as you know, Spain had been expelled from Cuba by the efforts of the War of Independence, but the United States had occupied the island and was ruling it under a military protectorate. And many ordinary Cubans wrote to General Gómez from various places in the countryside describing their distress, their disappointment, their difficulties. And so I was working my way through these boxes of letters, trying to capture a sense of vernacular understandings of rights and citizenship in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban War of Independence. But in one of these boxes, there was an incongruous document, typed with a purple typewriter ribbon on the letterhead of a Belgian cigar company, sitting right there intermixed with all of these letters. And it begins, and I'll read you just a sentence or two, but the letter begins, in early and ardent sympathy with the Cuban cause, I have been always and pride myself in being still one of your most sincere admirers. This is how you begin a letter when you're going to ask a favor, right? So, I would be highly honored should you have the kindness to authorize me to use your illustrious name for a brand of my best articles, your portrait adorning the labels whereof a proof copy is enclosed. So the first two sentences, this is a completely routine commercial request by a cigar maker who wants to put a famous Cuban on his cigars, which are manufactured from Mexican tobacco in a Belgian factory. So if an archivist had been going through this systematically, they might have tossed this letter out because they would have considered it a routine request. But the writer of the letter goes on to say, I may not be altogether unknown to some of the survivors of the last struggle, referring to the War of Independence. He said he's been a humble but steady contributor to the Cuban Fund. Many are the Cubans to whom I've lent a helping hand. Perhaps they remember me, and then here's where, for those of you who are historians in the US, it suddenly begins to click, as a member of Company C, 6th Louisiana Volunteers, Banks Division in 1863. So suddenly the Belgian cigar maker has become a Union soldier in the American Civil War. As representative of the 6th Ward, that's Treme, of the city of New Orleans at the Constitutional Convention of the state of Louisiana in 1867-68. And as Eric Foner knows better than anyone, that is, correct me if I'm wrong, pretty much the most radical state convention. Half of its members are men of color. It produces one of the most extraordinary state constitutions of the 19th century and beyond. Guarantee of absolute equal rights, universal method suffrage, equal access to public transportation, public accommodation, really remarkable. So how on earth did a Belgian cigar maker end up there? Presumably Hébrard Tachon, the signatory of the letter, anticipated that Máximo Gómez would wonder that. So he explains, and this is the last bit of the letter that I'll read. Born in France in 1841, I am of Haitian descent, as both my father and mother were born at Gonaïves in the beginning of this century. That's another signal, because of course what was born at Gonaïves in the beginning of the 19th century is the Haitian nation. Settled in New Orleans after the Revolution, my father, although in modest circumstances, left Louisiana for France with the only object in view of raising his 6 sons in a country where no infamous laws or stupid prejudices could prevent them from becoming men. So we realized here that this cigar maker is signaling to Máximo Gómez a kind of shared commitment to anti-racism. He's signaling shared military experience, although Máximo Gómez was a great general and Hébrard Tachon was a mere enlisted man. And so as I read through the letter, and copied it, transcribed it, brought it home to Michigan, the question really arose, could you perhaps see inside this letter and then inside whatever the story was behind the letter, a long 19th century that had a somewhat different arc Historians like to talk about the long 19th century. We generally place its ending points from the French Revolution to World War I. But here was a long 19th century with a Caribbean frame, from the Haitian Revolution to the cross-racial, anti-racist Cuban War of Independence. So as a Caribbeanist, I was intrigued. I put aside the other research I was meant to be doing and started trying to figure out, first, the answer to one question. Was Edward Tanchon just lying? I mean, it would have made a good story for him, whether it was true or not. So I went to Eric Foner's volume on members of the Constitutional Conventions. There was Edward Tanchon, a little tiny blurb, a couple of lines about him. So I went back to his interventions in the convention. So sure enough, the story started to check out. So the question then became, what kinds of things might one be able to see if one were able to piece together the generations of this family? So the first question would be, here we have an essentially unknown activist, but who appears to have a very strong and transnational rights consciousness and anti-racism. Would it be possible, in part because he's an unknown figure, to get some sense of vernacular origins of that kind of rights consciousness and figure out what the content was of his transnational vision? And the second question would be, is there some way to fit the story around the Caribbean and the greater Atlantic at the same time, so that we're looking at the small, relatively small triangle defined by Haiti, Cuba, and New Orleans, but then we're also framing it within what he is already reaching for, and we know, which is across the Atlantic to France. So I began to do couple of calculations that are thinking, gosh, he's born in 41, so he was alive for the French Revolution of 1848, wasn't very old. On the other hand, can we begin to pick up various threads of elements that we think of as that Atlantic history of rights consciousness? So, and another element of this would be, can we pick up elements of the memory of Haiti that are not the now somewhat cliched evocation of the specter of Haiti or the nightmare of Haiti or the volcano, and all these kinds of cliches that are used to describe white planters' image of Haiti. But instead, here we have someone who in a piece of commercial correspondence in 1899 is saying, I am of Haitian descent. And the last little piece that I was hoping for was that we might be able to link it quite directly to Cuba, because we know that most of the Saint-Domingue refugees who ended up in New Orleans were not the wave of planters who fled abolition. These were people who left a decade later in response to the Napoleonic invasion of Saint-Domingue, and they went first to Santiago, Cuba. So the pieces, in effect, were there potentially. We started to dig the first find, and then I'll just hand it over to Jean. The first find was to start to pull the thread of Edward Tanchon's own history, to locate his parents' marriage contract in the notarial archives in New Orleans, to pick up a cross-reference from the marriage contract to a document called Rectification of the Name of the Spouse, and in that document to find a copy of the baptismal record of Edward's mother. And the baptismal record of Edward's mother lists the name of Edward's grandmother, and she was named Rosalie, and she was a slave in Jérémy in Saint-Domingue. So at that point, we realized we could reach back to the 1780s in West Africa, and we could then try to pull the story forward. Why don't I hand it to Jean at that point?
So this collaboration, of course, was absolutely fantastic because it was possible, being two people, to extend the possibility to look at a lot of different locations for archives, and also to begin a strong discussion with the family. Because which is interesting in this book is that we, at the beginning, we were working in the archives, but very quickly the family found us on the internet because we were speaking of them and asked us, oh, are you working on our family? And we began to speak with them, and of course they had a lot of archives themselves. But not only that, and just to introduce you to this discussion, we received just 1 month ago a very nice mail from a student from Belgium, just writing us saying, oh, you know, I am a descendant of José Pinchon, and thank you so much to explain me that my family is not coming from Mexico, but coming from Haiti. You know, so that was really a part of the book. And I think that if we had just read the letter from Hébrard, we could have think that the general movement of this 5 generation was to go from this place, the Gulf and the North America, at the end of the 19th century, still in this post-slavery society and with all this difficulty linked with this post-slavery society, and to come to Europe, a place of freedom, a place of with 48, after 48, and to reconstruct the movement, this history of the movement from the bad Caribbean and America to the good Europe. But in fact, it was not that at all. And which is interesting is to see that all these people of the same family were permanently playing with their relationship to each country. And we can see in a modern way with their citizenship. So when Hébrard was writing to Maximo Gomez, he was writing as what? As a Belgian cigar maker, as a French. Oh, he was really linked as a cigar maker with French because he was a representative of the CETA, the monopoly of cigar in France, in Belgium. So, as French, no, he was permanently changing day after day, month after month, and from speaking to somebody to speaking to another one, he was permanently changing this relationship with nations, with citizenship, and so on. So what is really interesting for that is for us to have the possibility to install this history directly in a non-national territory. To install this directly because it was impossible to do it in another way. To install this history in a large and broad Atlantic, open to all the navigation, all the circulations, and to ask us what is important in this history in relationship with the circulation of these people in a territory, in a way, for them, in 19th century, without nations. So, when you look at the brothers, the survivors at the end of the 19th century, each one was trying to reinvent a manner to be in this Atlantic world. Hébrard was trying to be French, asking to the French government to confirm that he was really French. Even it was very difficult, in fact, to confirm that what was his citizenship. But the two other brothers, José and Ernest, was trying to be Belgian and to ask more than that, the true citizenship in Belgium, the one which gives you the possibility not only to vote but to be elected. Very few people in Belgium had this right at the end of the 19th century. So, who were they? That was really, really difficult to understand and to construct. But I think that if I take Hébrard, we spoke a little, we have each one somebody that we like more in the family. Rebecca love José. And I like a little more Hébrard. So if I take Hébrard, Hébrard was somebody who, in each moment important of his life, was able to say, I am completely from this place. I am completely somebody, not a citizen from it, but somebody involved in this place. And I think that when he speaks of his studies in France, before 48, just the year before 48, so he was in Pau in this moment. He was a very good student with a lot of satisfaction and prizes, and he was completely proud of this Frenchness, just to have been a student here. But of course, when you arrived in New Orleans during the Civil War, immediately he became somebody from the US. And of course, on the good side, but he could have been on the other side, because a lot of French descendants or French immigrants from Haiti in this moment could be on the two sides. So here, it changed immediately and was immediately somebody different. Some years after, just after the convention in '68, he was very upset with the evolution of the convention, and he just stopped. He wrote a letter to his mother saying, "I will stop to do politics at the end." And the conclusion of the letter was really interesting. He said, "I will become a vieux mulat." And what? Mulat. Without the R. So I will become an old mulat. Think, what is this sort of identity in this moment? No more US, no more France, no more, just a sort of coming back to something different, something which is not citizenship, which is not involved, a manner to be in an actor of history in its making, but a manner to say, I can come back on my community and start to do so. So I think that which is really interesting and fascinating in this family, its capacity to, in a world was very clearly a world in construction, a world in which each country was trying to be different of the others. The capacity of these people to go from a place to another place and to be each time from this place and not from another. So I just can conflict with that to say that when we wrote this book, I think for us, we were in a way rethinking completely what is to do an Atlantic history. And this family helped us to change our mind and to think about territory in a very different manner. And we thank you to the Tension family to help us to change our manner and to do our own historiographical term.
It's really a huge pleasure now to read the book and to have this opportunity to participate in a conversation with so thanks to them. Thank you to Shani Maison Française and to Emmanuelle for organizing the event. I'm gonna use some notes because I think it's gonna help me to say more faster, and there's a lot to say. So the book has just come out, but I keep reading everywhere it's a tour de force, and it is. And I think that as soon as you open it, you are impressed and a little bit awed by both the density of the research that this represents. It's so huge, but also the work of imagination, equally important, that it also represents. So Rebecca Scott and Jean Hébrard have pieced together from fragmentary sources dispersed in archives all over the Atlantic world the history of a family from the late 18th century to the late 19th century with a mid-20th century epilogue that I hope we'll get to speak about at some point. And this unfolding narrative is accompanied by a reconstruction of the much wider political and social dynamics in which this family history is embedded. So it is at the same time a micro-history and an Atlantic macro-history, and it combines the imperatives, the ambitions, political, intellectual, ethical of both these currents of historiography. So I think that despite the most of us still work in some ways within the bounds of national history, and more particularly within the bounds of linguistic histories, whether English, French, Spanish, Portuguese. Freedom Papers is in this regard a rare exception. So as I mentioned, the authors draw on sources from Cuba, New Orleans, Senegal, Mobile, Alabama, Belgium, the list goes on and on. And I'm curious to know a little bit about Haiti, actually. I know that you use the Saint-Domingue archival sources, and I'm wondering about the case of Haiti. So given that time is so short, I think what I want to do is just touch quickly on what for me are some of the really important contributions of this work, and then maybe at the end formulate a couple of quick questions. And I think that a lot of what I'm going to say has to do with my admiration for the way in which this book brings together things that are usually separate. So it brings together different kinds of historical questions, treated in different kinds of studies. So Freedom Papers is a work of Atlantic or global history. I would also characterize it as an important foray into trans-colonial history. So the movements, the migrations that are discussed are not just between colonies and metropoles, but among various colonial environments. And I think this kind of decentering is very important in and of itself, in the kind of reframing of Atlantic history that you have just gestured to. But it also, it has some very direct consequences. I'm thinking, for example, about the fact that the first part of the book is very familiar to me as someone who's primarily worked in the Francophone world. So all of the discussions of gens de couleur libre, métissage, and particularly the discussions of slaveholders who are themselves people of African descent. All of that is quite familiar in the Francophone, Hispanophone, Portuguese context. But then it's going to confront a set of readers who are much more familiar with the North American context. So different kinds of colonial historiography with different norms, different expectations about the history of slavery are juxtaposed here in a very fresh and important way, I think. So this is certainly a book about the history of slavery and emancipation. I think it's also a book about the history of migration, emigration, immigration, and all of the attendant dynamics of assimilation, integration, diaspora formation, community formation, emigrate community formation, those kinds of questions that are generally not integrated into histories of slavery. It's also, I think, a history, and I think you gestured to this a little bit, of nationhood and the evolution of nationality and the documentary history of nationality. So we follow the family across several generations. In the first stage, they live in a world in which many people are essentially stateless. And the most important documents for them are ones that attest to their social condition. Are they free, freed, affranchis, or enslaved? Later on, documents of nationality and that attest to their national identity become very significant. And the era of the emergent era of the nation state. It is a work of legal history, but also in a much broader and richer sense, a work on the history of legal culture. The members of the Tachon family clearly regard the letter of the law as very changeable and not very transportable across time and across political boundaries. On the other hand, they recognize from very early on, immediately I think, that the possession of written documents, notarized if possible, will be helpful even if the law changes or even if the law is not recognized in another jurisdiction. So that account of a legalized culture, I think, is very important. And finally, I would say that as a literary person of literary training, I very much appreciate the book's emphasis on the role of categories, labels, modes of representation, narratives. Categories that change across time, that disappear, sometimes to reappear unexpectedly at a new moment. The role of narrative, the way in which the various members of the Tachon family recount their biography or to a new narrative. Clearly they have a sense that there are narratives and they want to try to hook onto one or another of these different competing narratives. So I appreciate that very much, that interplay of a social, political, family history and a reflection on the role of representations. So, for my questions, I guess I'd like to ask a little bit about genealogy, the place of a kind of genealogical impulse, the quest for roots, which has been very important in the North American public history of slavery, as emblematized by the TV series Roots that Michelle and I once taught. And really, I think to the amusement of our French students, who, this quest for the idea that the history of slavery and should be about a quest for roots that would take you back for Africa. So this was this was a moment of defamiliarization of a historiographical norm, I think. So I'm just wondering about what the status of genealogy is for you. Genealogy, I guess typically goes from memory to document, and you very interestingly go from document to memory. So sometimes documents allow you to hypothesize about memories. I'm thinking about the baptismal names. Those are very moving moments in which it's hypothesized that the name that a baby was given reverts back to a lost sibling in Saint-Domingue. So it's a move from a kind of genealogy from a document to the memory, which is quite interesting. And my other question, I guess, is how you see the book fitting into the historiography of the Haitian Revolution, which I think is in a kind of transition now, from an emphasis on political consciousness among the enslaved to a bit more of a focus on contingencies. The work of Laurent Dubois in particular obviously emphasizes rights discourse and political consciousness. Recent work, I'm thinking of Jeremy Hopkins' history of the revolution, much more archivally document focused and much more interested in contingencies. So given the kind of microhistory that you do, I'm wondering how you see this book as a contribution to this changing historiographical landscape.
So I come to this with a actually first-hand experience of a fairly similar type of research. So it's been extremely interesting reading your work, and we did exchange some information a couple of years ago, the research I've been doing actually started with the ownership history of the house in southwestern France, and I ran across a deed in the 1818 deed that involved sellers of that house who were owners of the house, but were residents. Some of them were residents of Cuba, and others were residents of New Orleans. And I wondered, what the heck? Who the heck are these people? And so it's sort of the same impulse you described that motivated your initial research. I tried to find out, my curiosity was piqued, and I tried to find out who those people were. And it took me to Cuba, New Orleans, of course, to Saint-Domingue and Haiti. Something I noticed is that there is an appendix to the book that is a history of the research itself. So the research itself has a history, and sort of an interesting one. What's remarkable, and it may be an obvious point to you, but this type of research probably would not have been possible even 10 or 15 years ago. What you need to put together a history like this is sort of the power of random finds made possible through Google searches or things you find on bulletin boards or general bulletin boards. In fact, I came across a post that Jean-Luc had posted on the Haiti genealogy board. So in order, because you have to control material from so many different places, so many different archives, that it's almost impossible to do it the old-fashioned way. I mean, you have to have help from databases, online databases. Otherwise, it would be really finding a needle in a haystack if you are trying to reconstruct individual trajectories. One remark I have about, and Madeleine said that this was in part a history of migrations. One thing that struck me looking at my characters and your characters is that these migration networks cover a lot of ground geographically. They cover 3 continents. There are huge distances traveled, but yet they concerned a surprisingly small universe of people, small groups of people. If you're talking about the 3 colors in Saint-Domingue in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, that's no more than 20,000 people. 3 colors in New Orleans in the late 18th century, that's a few hundred. And then it goes up precisely when those from Saint-Domingue go to New Orleans in 1809, about doubles. But these are small groups, and these are face-to-face communities. These people all knew each other. And they probably knew each other's family histories. And in fact, at some point I was ready to bet that my characters and your characters in fact met. And they probably did. And we don't know if they met in New Orleans or in Saint-Domingue, but we can be almost sure that they met in Pau, which is sort of, you can think of an extremely unlikely place in Pau, France. But they were probably, the children were probably students in the lycée of Pau together at the same time. There is a long article by a scholar called Darrell Meadows about migrants in the French Atlantic community in the 18th and 19th centuries, and he says that these French migrants, it was a common experience. They were flabbergasted to run into familiar faces they had known on the other side of the Atlantic, and said, "Wow, this is an amazing coincidence." But of course, it was not coincidence. These were chain migration networks, and they came from the same places, and they went to the same places across the Atlantic. I have sort of a couple of questions, and these are open-ended questions. I wonder what it means to do sort of a transgenerational study like this. What is transmitted, what is not through the generations. And if you think about literary analogs, I can think of some novels by Maurice Condé that tell similar stories across several generations. There is one entitled Descendants. So it sort of reminds me also that this fictional analog of this story. And the other question, which is actually related to the first. So this is in many ways a work of historical anthropology, but also in some ways a work of anthropology tout court, because you interviewed the descendants, so there is oral history. You spoke to them, and they volunteered information. And I had the same experience. I identified descendants of the people I was working on, and it was and initially I actually tried an experiment, which was to ask them what they knew about their family history without saying anything, in order not to contaminate the experiment. And it was really interesting to see how the kind of the very fragmentary information that goes through the generations, so some accurate, some not, some distorted, and of course I had to write it down, because the moment I told them, then of course the memories would be completely reconstructed. And so I wonder if you went through the same issues and the same experiences, and of course there are two characters in your story who are especially relevant with respect to this. It's Marie-Josée Pinchamp, who, if I recall, you say she thinks she is originally from Mexico. At the same time, she says, I have color. So there's some sort of a vague sense that she could have African ancestry, but you said that there's no evidence that she had any knowledge of that. But maybe somehow she did. But that's an interesting question. And of course the awareness of his own family story that you find in someone like Hébrard, who says, I'm of Haitian descent, although he does not have if I remember, he doesn't have the information entirely correct. It's not good naive, but it's something else. So how the memory is transmitted from one generation to the next and the following generation is in itself an interesting question for the historical work itself.
It testifies to the special benefits of collaborative work, the kinds of collaborations to which historians typically are allergic, and to which there are too few professional rewards, but which the authors here put to good use. They're very different expertise, and they also mobilize other scholars and the descendants of the families in ways not just a matter of sort of adding sort of a little bit of evidence here, contributions there, but significantly shaping the final, the very nature of the text. You see that especially in the epilogue, which I hope you get a chance to talk about. So it's quite appropriate, actually, that the traditional acknowledgement section is an acknowledgments and collaboration, as it's actually the title of it, and that's made very clear exactly what that means. Freedom Papers examples, perhaps most obviously, has been said, the full promise of Atlantic history, surpassing in its reach in the connections it identifies and pursues most nearly every other work of history that passes under that name of Atlantic history, with its sequence of departures and arrivals from Senegal to the southeast corner of Saint-Domingue, to Santo Domingo de Cuba, to New Orleans, to southern France, back to New Orleans, to Veracruz, to Mobile, to Antwerp, to London, and then finally to the slave labor and death camps at Ravensbrück, and then also finally to the unnamed island off the coast of West Africa. I found something that island was in the final pages of the book.
I'll tell you when we turn off.
Okay. These movements take place against the backdrop of war and revolution. So we have here sidelong individual glances at the revolution in the Toro in the Senegal Valley, the French and Haitian Revolution, the Spanish Wars for Independence, the 1848 Revolution in France, the U.S. Civil War, the French invasion of Mexico, and then the German invasion of Belgium during World War II. Yet it's not quite right to refer to these as the backdrop, since for the Pinchamp family, these crises represent moments of rupture, of opportunity, and perhaps most consistent moments of transition in the history of the family. Although it's sometimes difficult to say whether the apparent link between political crisis and war and the shifting family fortunes are always caused by war and revolution, or whether war and revolution generate the documents that make study of key moments in the family's history possible. I think some further thought might be given to the sorts of records that wars generate and how these compare with moments of peace. The mobility on display here is social as well as physical mobility. If the trajectory viewed from a distance is upward from slavery in Saint-Domingue to a tobacco fortune 3 generations later in Antwerp, the series of reversals, near bankruptcies, and failed enterprises along the way suggests that the ultimate fortune was in some respects fortunate indeed. One is reminded in several opening vignettes that the story of commerce in the 18th century and 19th century Atlantic world was sometimes one of gradual decline or even catastrophic loss, not always the steady accumulation of wealth. And with the story of mobility goes an extended rumination throughout on the complexities and ambiguities of citizenship, as we've heard. We have Edouard Tichon, born in France but not a French citizen, who emigrates to the U.S. and declares his American citizenship while keeping evidence of French nationality under lock and key, who ends life as a Belgian citizen. And then there's his older brother, Joseph, born in New Orleans, largely raised in France, proclaimed and then recognized as a Mexican citizen before settling in Antwerp, where he would pose at least for commercial regions vaguely as a Cuban. Examples multiply across the work. From one perspective, this might look like a chronicle of statelessness or an attempt to secure and define a nationality. But what becomes rather more clear, at least to me, is just how slippery, up for grabs, definitions of citizenship and nationality were across the long 19th century. But I'll confess that I'm most taken by this work as a contribution to family history, perhaps in part because the history of the family has fared so poorly in what falls under the rubric of the history of the Atlantic world. There are a number of what might be described now as reference books for Atlantic history. They appear with increasing regularity, volumes of collected essays in various forms. To take perhaps the most prominent and most recent, there's the Oxford Handbook of the Atlantic World, published just a year ago. What's remarkable about all of these works is how it is the only mere absence of Atlantic history as a subject, as a category, as something that ought to be thought about in an Atlantic context. The Oxford Handbook of the Atlantic World has one very good essay by Carol Shamus, who works on British North America, that tries to provide a little bit of a synthesis for household formation and marriage. But what's most remarkable about that essay is how little she has to synthesize and try to think about the history of family in an Atlantic context. What we have, to the extent that we have anything at all, are families in particular places, or in a few instances, family networks spread across a few places, but rarely, if ever, in an intergenerational story, one that pursues relations and memory in an Atlantic context over time. And for me, this is really one of the most special parts of the book. And there are many payoffs here. To mention only one, it's quite clear that the capacity of the family to survive the insecurities of their commercial ventures in the 19th century depended on the size and the extent of its intrafamilial and interpersonal networks, the capacity to mobilize capital and friendships handed down across the generations. And this in turn directs attention to the household, a unit of analysis critical, I know, to much work on the history of slavery in the United States, but inadequately developed, I believe, in the study of slavery in the Caribbean. Much of the fascination in the first part of the book, at least for me, derives from the depiction of what might be crudely categorized as master-slave relations in Saint-Domingue, Cuba, and New Orleans in the late 18th and early 19th century. Although what's reported here upends whatever notion that term master-slave relations tends to invoke. So we're reminded of the extent of slaveholding by men, and here particularly women of African descent. And there's some wonderful, wonderful accounts of women as in Saint-Domingue as property owners, as slave owners, as controllers of capital that I think, at least for North Americans, sprinkle some of our ideas of both women and slaves in this period. And there are the astonishing, there are purchases of a spouse, a child, and a mother-in-law to manumit them. And there are astonishing instances in 1803 when Napoleon's army in Saint-Domingue threatened to restore slavery, and Michael Vincent, who's sort of the patriarch of the family, manumits Rosalie, his partner, though she was no longer a slave. And so you have this interesting moment where a manumission document is made out for a woman who's effectively a spouse to liberate her, because the fear is of the restoration of slavery. Unless there are actually a clear manumission document, one's status is going to be very vulnerable. So if you have a manumission of somebody who's in fact not a slave, but who might become a slave in the future as a kind of a warding off against it. And I really think it encourages us to really be careful when we think about what these documents, often these documents are operating in all sorts of strategic and creative ways that the sort of our categories don't always help us understand. So what runs throughout this work is a refusal to be taken in by the familiar categories of analysis, to reject the assumptions that we know what we're talking about when we refer to racial designations, status designations, citizenship designations. These have meanings, but in this work they are fluid, evolving, creatively and strategically defined, and discarded as necessary. So what I do have is in fact an extended appreciation for the work, and I don't really long and hard about sort of challenging questions and sort of trying to find ways to tear this apart. At least for me, I don't see any. It's really a terrific book. I do want to close with one, I guess, sort of meta question about it. It's really about the book as a whole and the project as a whole. There's a welcome, actually, refusal to provide a conclusion for the work. Right? There's no distillation, no summary, no sort of conclusion that kind of brings it all together. It closes with an epilogue about the family in the 20th century, and then ends, if not abruptly, I think perhaps prematurely. This is one of those very rare works of history that one might wish was even longer, to follow out all the trends of the Tonchol family. I mean, there's a way that one actually is left wanting to know more about the branches and more about the sort of especially some of the 20th century legacies. But the resistance to a conclusion leaves us with the silence in some ways about what we are to make of this account. We might have in children's literature the moral of the story. And this, in so many other ways, we're left wanting even more. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here to talk about it for many reasons. I've known Rebecca Scott for quite a while. Nobody's really counting. I've known Jean Hébrard for a good while. I've known Jean's wife a lot longer than he has. She was a superb graduate student here in American history and now is a professor at Michigan. And I may be the first person who actually taught this book. Right after it came out, I was teaching, thanks to Pierre, I was teaching in our little master's program at Reed Hall last May in history and literature, and I decided to give them this book to read because it does involve France as well as the rest of the Atlantic world. And so it's been on my mind for a long time. One of the advantages or disadvantages of coming last is that a number of the things I was going to say have already been said by the panelists, and I'm not going to repeat them all. I do want to, so let me just point out a few aspects of the book that are most striking to me. First of all, as we've heard, it is a truly Atlantic history, and it's, you know, that is important because, as Chris said, Atlantic history is much more often talked about than done, and especially by historians. Literary people take one novel from France and one from the Caribbean, and there's your Atlantic history, you know, but historians seem to want a larger body of documentation. And the story of this particular family is contextualized within an introduction to the history of West Africa, the slave trade, the Haitian Revolution, the Cuban War for Independence, the American Civil War, Reconstruction, and many other aspects of 19th century history. The one question one might ask, which of course is asked of all microhistory, if that's what we're going to call this, is the question of typicality or representativeness. And that's one question, is how you thought about that. The authors do not claim that this family history is quote-unquote typical, whatever exactly that may mean. They do seem rather exceptional in some ways in their incredible array of movements and law, relations and places that ended up in businesses and other things, but maybe not in that world. More interesting to me is this question which the book's title suggests, which is documents, the importance of physical documents, these freedom papers. The book is actually kind of focused on really a handful of, I don't know, 4 or 5 or 6 or something, key documents produced in various places, in Haiti, in Cuba, in the United States, and elsewhere, and what these mean about how these documents are the anchor to this family's quest for rights, for nationality, for freedom in some cases. The importance of these paper documents. It also is an interesting illustration of the difference between a kind of a Franco and Spanish origin society and the United States. These places are full of people who we have no equivalent to here, notaries. There's all over the place these notaries who you can go to with a document and get them to fill it out or stamp it or something. We don't have anything, we have notary publics, but that's not at all what we're talking about. So it's a little piece of the culture that to Americans seems awfully odd, but the notary is very important if you want your document to actually have that way. Of course, they also indicate that at least one of these documents was quite likely forged, actually, by members of this family in order to advance claims to freedom, etc. I think that I want to talk for a minute about what this book tells us about one little piece of it, which is Reconstruction in the United States, because as Rebecca started, that's where this began, really, with this man talking about how he'd been in this this constitutional convention and everything. We tend to, when we talk about the abolition of slavery in the United States, the Reconstruction period, we tend to, for good reason, talk about the origins of those ideas in a sort of Anglo-American context. Notions of natural rights, the Declaration of Independence, or evangelical Protestantism as the sort of roots of anti-slavery radicalism. But here we have in New Orleans a different trajectory into the Reconstruction struggle for equal rights, which is coming out of a French heritage and the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution and the French Revolution of 1848. And it's got a slightly different language than the Anglo view of Reconstruction. And as Rebecca has written elsewhere, and in this book, it throws up to the fore this question of what she has called public rights, which the Louisiana Constitution of 1867 or 68 elevates this notion of public rights far above any other state constitution of radical Reconstruction. What we mean by public rights is not just the right to vote, not just the right to equal opportunity to labor, not just equality before the law, but equality in treatment in the public sphere. That is to say, the ability to go on transportation equally, into places of public accommodation, to be treated in public venues without racial inequality. And that is really pushed very hard by this Free Negro group in New Orleans. Now, the book actually should lead us to think more about that. It's a small number of people, as Pierre said, but they had a rather large impact in some ways on the development of radical Reconstruction. I'll just give you one example. Abraham Lincoln's first embrace of black suffrage in a limited way came as a result of meeting with two delegates, not your man, but two delegates from free Negroes from New Orleans in 1864. They came to the White House and they said, hey, look, Lincoln, a new government is being created in Louisiana. Southern Louisiana is occupied by the Union Army. A new anti-slavery government is being created, but they're not giving us any rights. And we have certainly, we are property, we are educated, we have as much qualification to vote as these white people do. In fact, more than a lot of them. And Lincoln actually said, you're right. And he sent a letter to the governor, the military governor of Louisiana, saying, I think you ought to let in to vote the quote-unquote very intelligent blacks, that is, these very people. So they are pushing this onto the national agenda, and what they're doing in New Orleans is being noticed by people like Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, radical Republicans in Congress. So this is not all exactly in the book, but I think it should lead us to think more broadly about the role of that particular group in the history of radical Reconstruction. Now, as I think Chris sort of indicated, I think another interesting thing about the book is how it sort of destabilizes a lot of the categories we take for granted. And we have to take for granted. When we talk in big generalized terms about slavery, emancipation, freedom, that's what we talk about, race relations, empire. But all those things are very complicated when it comes to a single family. And there's no trajectory. There's no inevitable trajectory from slavery to freedom. And in fact, it's possible to go back the other way, as we heard. After you've gotten your freedom, somebody may come along and put you back into slavery, just depending on the fortunes of war and the fortunes of politics. Slavery is abolished in Haiti, then it's reestablished, at least the French try to reestablish it, and the status of people is always rather ambiguous and up for grabs, and that's one of the reasons that these documents are so important. In one family, there are often slaves and slave owners, free people, slaves, all related to each other. And people who claim multiple nationalities, people with contradictory or conflicting political views, people engaged in economic partnerships who then later sue each other for money. In other words, just like any family, they're always fighting with each other as well as trying to move ahead. So, and the whole question, which has sort of become a cliche, of agency is very interesting in here, how it is actually exercised. Agency is not just an act of rebellion. These people rebel at various times. They confront the state, but they also use the system. They use what the system offers to them. They work within it to gain advantages for themselves, as well as sort of resistance in a kind of abstract way. I just want to conclude by saying that the people have mentioned the ending, and I think it is a wonderful ending. It may be nice to have more, but give them a break, they're a lot of work here. But it ends with, a kind of really odd and interesting story of one of the descendants here, a controversy over one of the women marrying a Belgian white man or a Belgian man, but they couldn't marry in Belgium because she was known to have some African blood, so they went to Great Britain, where lovers can do anything they want, and they got married in Great Britain in 1937, and there was a sort of a cause célèbre about that, having to flee to Britain in order to get married. And then in World War II, here's where the historical irony or trajectory comes full circle. This woman went back to Belgium, she joined the resistance, she was captured, and she was put into a slave labor camp, not an extermination camp, a slave. So she's suddenly back in slavery 2 centuries after her ancestor was removed from West Africa into slavery in the New World. And she died there, and then there's a whole controversy about whether she can be recognized as someone who was a victim of the Nazis for political reasons or for racial reasons. I won't even go into this, a long, complicated debate within Belgium. But then I may have the genealogy slightly wrong because I read this a long time ago, or a year ago, but her daughter is today living in Africa. So the story goes full circle from Rosalie, who is picked up in West Africa and brought to Haiti, and 2 centuries or so later, her great-great-great-great-granddaughter, as a free woman of her own choice, is living back in Africa. Here's my one question. We were all told to ask questions. One of the very interesting things about this book is that the authors speculate a lot. They do not try to fudge over the fact that there are big gaps in this documentary record. 5 or 6 documents cannot tell you the whole story. And they speculate. They tell you, well, this may be the case, or we think likely this was the case. And I just would like to hear a little bit more about how they thought about speculating, which is something historians try, I think, not to do. We like to seem like we're certain about everything we say, even when we're not. And, how do you fit speculation when you might well be wrong? It's educated guesswork into a historical narrative that you've constructed.
So let me just grab 2 of the questions. One of the ones that I thought was particularly relevant, how we fit this into histories, evolving histories of the Haitian Revolution. And I think in some ways the emphasis that Christopher Brown placed on family history and that Eric evoked with the complexity of these families is part of the answer to that question. That the usual way of narrating the Haitian Revolution, which is to move these puzzle pieces called the gens de couleur, the slaves, the uprising, the planters, the grands blancs, the petits blancs. As you get closer and closer, the interconnections, first of all, between people who could be put in those categories, and then the way people move in and out of those categories, leads not just to the usual invocation of fluidity. I think we actually wrote the whole book without ever using the word fluidity. Because it isn't that these categories slosh around. It's that the categories themselves are just plain inadequate and unstable. And as historians, we really ought to be awfully careful before we use them. So that sense that we can describe groups, and maybe even that we could have somehow sought a family that was typical by knowing a priori what the most common groups were and then choose. That's exactly the opposite of this approach. We assume the categories aren't a prioris, it's not just we don't claim typicality, we really want typicality. The discipline for this story came from the fact that we knew almost nothing about the family when we started, but anything they did, we had to explain. And that means we had to explain things we never even would have thought would normally be included in a history of the Haitian Revolution. So I think that's what made that part particularly exciting. On the question of speculation and collaboration and whether there will be more and so on, let me just say a word or two. This is a complex collaboration, and the book is actually being entirely rewritten in French by my colleague. And you will notice that the word forgery does not appear in the English edition. Our understanding is that each one has the veto in his or her native language, and I didn't let the word get into this edition. I say that the family caused documents to be brought into existence, which can be the perfectly legitimate procedure of going to a notary and having the notary draw up a consensual understanding. That's perfectly legitimate. Now, sometimes there was no notary, and sometimes there's the contradiction. It's 1803, it's a manumission paper, this makes no sense. But it's something in some ways different from a forgery. It's actually created by all the people named in it and signed by the man who actually wrote it. But it's evoking, as you say, a kind of anticipatory.
You referred to a birth certificate, right? Wasn't there a birth certificate that she turns up in New Orleans with that seemed to come out of nowhere?
Well, it's going to be different in the French edition. I don't think it comes out of nowhere. I think she went to the appropriate civil authorities in Haiti and had the original birth registry copy, and she took it with her. We find Rosalie, the Nation Poulard, born probably in 1787, and who, as you know, so she was a war refugee from Saint-Domingue during the Revolution. She lived in Santiago. She put her daughter on a boat for New Orleans in the care of a godmother, and she, Rosalie, went back to Haiti, the only country in the plantation Americas where she could be sure of freedom and citizenship. And then, almost 25 years later, we found her on a passenger list on a boat coming from Saint-Domingue to New Orleans, almost certainly carrying that officially certified copy of the birth registry with her, so that her daughter could go to a notary, bring a document into existence that would attest to the fact that the daughter had a surname. She would say, my father recognized me at birth. He never married my mother, but he recognized me at birth, so I have a last name. Her daughter never had a last name before. And then in a kind of twist against this picture that we're so familiar with of elite, light-skinned, free people of color, bilingual in New Orleans, who does this family choose as the godmother at the baptism of a baby then in 1836? They ask Rosalie to stand at the baptismal font in Saint Louis Cathedral as the godmother for one of her own grandchildren, which means the fact that Rosalie is born in Senegambia. It means that the family of her daughter and husband, who in some sense are in that category of artisans of mixed ancestry, are actually choosing the African grandmother for protection. So the book will be a little bit different when it comes out in French, and it will also enable us to add some things that we've only discovered since it came out. So we just realized, putting a lot of pieces together, that one of Edward Tachon, the young man who wrote the letter, or who's older than who wrote the letter, but who served in the Civil War, his closest business associate was a man named Arthur Grironovich, and we just realized he's a member of the Committee of Citizens for the repeal of the Separate Car Act. That is to say, he helped support the challenge in Plessy versus Ferguson. So that means that Edward Tachon, in the years that he wrote that letter to Gomez, he's receiving the news from Louisiana, first of the campaign, broad-ranging campaign in support of Homer Plessy, and then the loss at the Supreme Court, which crushes the public rights tradition in Louisiana. So there will be more in the next edition. Do you want to?
2 minutes. To come back on the question of family, perhaps, and because it was really important, and each time, why a family could be a unit of book, and it's not literature, it's a history, and we know that literature invented, particularly at the end of the 19th century, this question of to write saga with mainly a strong question: what is wrong in a family? that's a question of somebody writing the saga. What is wrong? Is it something, a disease? Is it a malediction? Is it So in history, I think that a family is something a little different. In history, a family is a community, and a community with a lot of links, and all around them. This one we discovered very recently is one of them. So how to, as historian, to work on this net of people linked by what? So the question is linked by what? And I think that they are doing two things permanently. First, they are acting, and as historians, we are really interested by their manner to act in revolution periods, in political situation, but they are also permanently reconstructing and constructing a representation of all that, and a memory of all that. And so I think that for us, the family is this sort of fantastic situation where you have by the family and because of the family a discussion, a permanent discussion of what is happening. The exchange of letters is fantastic between each one, because each one is explaining to the other in a different way, like the other brother, what is happening around them. And I think that is, and that can come to the question of the typicality. Why that can be interesting for an historian? Because it's a manner in which history is coming back to touch each people in its singularity and to transform him or her in their singularity. And the manner in which they not only act but try to give a representation of that. And the family, of course, other groups and family can do the same, but the family has, for us historians, this fantastic habit to exchange and to write, and that is really, really important. So yes, because of the construction of a memory and because of this successive break in the construction of the memory of the family, that I think the family is a good unit for the historian.
This has to do with something that Woody commented on, which is maybe an arc in the book itself. There was mention of speculation and maybe more imagination and poesis. And it seems that in the course of the book there is more about the beginning. So you have fewer documents at the beginning. So the first chapter is about Rosalie. You have to, the effort of imagination is greater at this point, and it seems that it's actually very seamlessly goes into a more kind of analytical and descriptive quality in the last chapters where you have more documents. So you have less freedom from the papers, and you have more constraints. I was wondering, is this something that that's something that you became aware of, or something that was important, in the process of writing the book?
Sure. John Christian Sub, who's right there, probably doesn't remember this conversation, but when I presented a very early paper about Rosalie, you came up to me and said, "Oh, Rebecca, you've done the work you and Jean are doing. You divide up your sections using a classic 19th century novelistic technique, and it works very well." I said, "What technique is that?" And you said, "Oh, well, it's clear. You've opened each chapter with an arrival, each section. This was just a short paper. You've opened each section with an arrival, and you've closed it with a departure." And I think at that moment, we talked about it, and we realized, okay, that is what we will try to do throughout the book. There may be a little exception when we get to Reconstruction because it's very dense material. So up until but not including the epilogue, it has this spatial arrival-departure feel to it, which I guess works because the fiction writers of the 19th century who were writing serially learned that it works well with our psyches as readers because we want to turn the next page and see what happens when they land. So for example, in terms of categories, Joseph Cachan leaves France never having been marked by color. as the boat lands and he settles in New Orleans, he'll be marked as mulâtre. So those kinds of things worked well. Now the epilogue, we never anticipated writing. We thought the book would end. Our plan was that the book would begin with Edward's letter to Gomez to sort of explain the story. And then we would go through the whole, so begin in 1899, and then it would reach all the way back to Rosalie's birth in Senegambia, and then through Saint-Domingue in Cuba and so forth. And we would then come back to the letter at the end as we reached 1899, at which point the letter would have a different meaning for the reader, because instead of being a curiosity, it would now be a closure. And that's how the book was going to end. And then we learned about Marie-Josée Pinchon, and we just learned this small piece, which was the contested marriage in England. Martha Jones found a reference to that, and we tracked that, and we thought, okay, well this will enable us to end with 1937, when the issue of race and racial designation is taking on a new meaning in the 20th century. So the barrier to her marriage has that echo. It's 37 in London, it's the League of Colored Peoples, it's a moment of great radicalism. So we thought that would be the epilogue. And so then we just asked the family, could you just clarify for us, this Marie-Josée, whose daughter is she exactly? We know she's one of the great-grandchildren. And they said, oh, well, if you want to know about Marie-Josée, you'll need to talk to Françoise. So we spoke to Françoise, and she said, well, if you want to know about Marie-Josée, you're going to need to speak to Michel. So we spoke to Michel, and Michel said, we've never understood. She disappeared, she died during the war, we've just never understood. And Michel's mother was a 6-year-old at the time, no one ever explained. And Michel's response really was, I have a lot of documents, you're historians, can you figure out what happened? And so the project took another 2 years, because we realized at that point that our reciprocal relationship with the family was such that once we'd been asked, we couldn't not do it. And then part of the reason that you see so little speculation at the end is that when you're writing about participation in the resistance against the Nazis in Belgium, everybody is always predisposed to think that you're exaggerating and that it's just family memory and that everybody claims that their aunt or uncle was in the resistance. So that, the epilogue, more than anything else, had to be just locked down so that it wasn't vulnerable to the critique that we were being drawn into a family memory. And then Jean visited Ravensbrück concentration camp, and actually the staff at the camp are preparing a small memorial of Marie-Josée, whom they, of course, know nothing about.
But what you were saying just about the beginning of the book we have in fact one sentence. Rosalie of Nation Coulard. That is only element. We have to write the first chapter. And we wrote the first chapter with that. And in a way, the last chapter, the epilogue, is a little the same, because we have no documents really on this, what she was living in the resistance and so on and so on. So in a way, it's interesting to see that beginning in a slave society, ending in a reconstruction of the slave society by the Nazis, archives in a way disappear in the same manner. You know, it's very difficult to write the history of a biography of a slave, because we have archives of the owners, not of the slave. And it's the same for the history of Ravensbrück.
They burned them. They burned them as the Nazis burned them. They burned the files as they left the camp. They knew that they didn't wish to read them.